What mistakes do you see podcasters making that really keep them from growing their shows?
Yeah, so there's a couple. I would say the first one that comes to mind is that every podcaster thinks that they have a growth problem, when in reality, what I found is that most of them have a retention problem. So they're not able to keep people listening week after week after week. And that usually manifests itself in one of two ways. Number one is they have poor intros to their episodes. So, you press play on the podcaster's episode and they just talk about the weather, or it just takes forever for them to get to the point, or there's like 3 minutes of theme music or something where, a podcast listener, when they press play on your episode, they haven't yet fully decided. They haven't fully committed to your episode yet. So you need those first few seconds to convince them why they should pick your 20, 30, 60 plus minute episode to spend time with rather than all of the other options that they have, which is quite a lot. So podcasters think that when they get the download, their job is done, when that's actually just when the job begins. So when a podcaster comes to me and they're like, help, my growth strategy isn't working, I say, that may be true, but first, well, can you tell me what your average completion rate is? And they're like, what's that? And I'm like, exactly. Completion rate is a metric that you can get in the Apple Podcasts analytics dashboard. You can also get it in Spotify's, but you can't get it where you upload your podcast episodes, which is called your hosting provider. They don't have that information. It's not an analytic that they have. So you have to go to Apple, find your episode completion rate, understand what it is. And if it's below 65 or 75%, that means that on average, people are pressing play on their episode and they're like, meh, and then they're turning your show off. They're not listening to it. And when that happens, the odds that they're going to come back next week are very low. So when that is the case, which I found is more often than not, a podcaster looks at their download metrics and they're like, every week it's 200, 200, 200. Why is my show stuck at 200? But what they don't see is that it's not the same 200 people week after week. It's maybe 150 new people who tune in and they're like, I'm not really hooked. They leave and they don't come back. So the podcaster actually has churn. So that's the number one mistake, is not being able to hold the listeners that you get. When you fix that many times, the growth strategy that you're using just begins to work because you didn't have a growth problem in the first place.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I've even seen my show get stuck in those places where I feel like I'm getting the downloads, I'm getting enough of them, but I'm not seeing the growth that I want. And it goes in stages, right? I'll have a growth and then it'll dip or then it'll stay steady. But I didn't even really think about the retention and the fact that it might be different listeners each week. I was actually thinking it's all the same listeners. They just found my show, they like it, they're staying with me, but I'm not getting new ones. But that might not be the case. So really looking at that retention. Now, if we were to look at our retention and we see that it is pretty low, if they're jumping in and jumping out right away, what are a few quick fixes that we could do to really see, hopefully see a retention increase right away?
So the quickest number one fix is having better intros to your episodes. And usually when I say podcast intro, what podcasters think of is they're like, oh, I have an intro. And it's this like pre-recorded thing that they recorded 3 years ago where it's theme music and then welcome to the XYZ podcast. Here's your host. And it's like, nobody's listening to that, number one. It's not effective. Everyone's skipping it, right? It's like, how many of us sit and watch the entire intro of a show on Netflix and don't hit the skip button? Most of us hit the skip button. Your listeners do the same thing. So usually people they're like, they want to be efficient. I want to record this intro once and never have to do it again. But that's actually one of the most inefficient things you can do, because you're making all the rest of the time that you spend on your podcast inefficient because nobody's paying attention, because you've, automated the most important part, which is the intro. So here's how to really quickly fix your intros. What I recommend is that when a listener presses play on your podcast episode, the first thing that they hear is your voice. It's not a voiceover artist. It's not a clip from later in the episode. It's not an ad for your products or services. It's not music. It's your voice. And you are right away hooking them in. My favorite way to hook a listener is the classic copywriting framework that is called Pain Vision Solution. Pain Vision Solution. And so in order to figure out what the pain point is, basically what that means is your episode that you're putting out there exists to make a pain go away, ideally, to solve some sort of problem. So you need to understand, okay, what problem is my episode solving? Which, by the way, sidebar,
Mm.
this is another thing that most podcasters don't think of. When they put their title up for their episode, they'll be like, in this episode, I interviewed Joe Schmo. The
Mhm.
listener does not know who Joe Schmo is or why they should listen to you talk to Joe Schmo for an hour, or let alone hear Joe Schmo's life story. So, again, sidebar, a little bit upstream way to solve this problem is to get really good at articulating what what is the point of this episode. And what I teach people is every episode you publish should answer a specific question. If you don't know what the question is, neither do your listeners, and they're not going to tune in. So, when you write your intros, you want to say, okay, what is the question that this episode is answering? And then you talk about the pain point that leads to this question. So, for example, if we were to make a podcast episode about how to grow a podcast, maybe that's too meta. If we were to do a podcast, right, like that sometimes gets confusing. If we were to do a podcast episode about how to grow a business without social media,
Okay, perfect.
the way I would introduce that podcast episode is this: it would be play. Are you a business owner who is feeling completely overwhelmed with how much time you have to spend on social media? Do you wish that instead you could grow your business without touching social media at all? Well, today we are going to teach you exactly how you can make that happen, because today on the show, I'm featuring Kevin Schmidlin. And Kevin Schmidlin is going to give you a 3-step framework on how to grow your business without social media. What I did there in 30 seconds was pain, vision, solution. The solution is this episode. And in just that 30 seconds, the listener's like, yes, I want this. Let me put my phone away and I'm going to listen to this whole episode. That little quick 30-second shift makes all the difference in the world. In fact, 2 years ago, I worked with a client. So he came to me. His show was stuck at 12,000 downloads per episode. So he thought.
Hmm.
He was doing every growth strategy in the book, all of them. And yet his show was stuck. I pressed play. I was like, Nate, you don't have a growth problem. You have a retention problem. I taught him the pain vision solution framework. Within 3 months, his show had tripled to 36,000 downloads per episode. And it's because his show was leaking, right? When people have a retention problem, I say, it's like your show, it's like trying to fill a wicker basket with water. And you're just like, I think I need a fire hose. This thing isn't filling up. And it's like, no, you got a bunch of holes in the bottom. But when you have a solid intro, it's like turning your show into a steel bucket, way easier to grow.
Mm, I love that because I think we're so worried on, okay, the music intro has to be perfect or, all the other parts of it and not thinking about what's that kind of hook, what's that catch, what's going to keep them to want to actually listen to the rest of the episode. I am curious too when it comes to calls to action. I know
Yeah.
there are some discrepancies on when should we put that in. Like you were talking about in the beginning, sometimes people just start talking about their life and they don't get into what the episode's going to be about. Same thing, like they'll start talking about their program or the thing that they want to sell or the new webinar coming out, but they don't actually hook somebody first. Are there any kind of rules of thumb or things to think about when it comes to CTAs and talking about the products or the things that you are featuring?
Absolutely. So there's really three, like in the podcast advertising world, there's three types of ads that you can buy or sell, right? There's pre-roll, mid-roll, and post-roll. Pre-roll is when an ad gets played as soon as the listener presses play. Mid-roll is when the ad goes somewhere in the middle of the episode. Think like, we'll be back to the show right after this. Post-roll is when ads play after the show is over. All three of them have their time and their place. What you're describing is when a business owner is using pre-roll to pitch their own products or services. That really doesn't work well because on a regular basis, because the listener experiences, they read the episode title and they're like, oh wow, this sounds interesting. Let me see if this is any good. And then they press play and the business owner's like, before I give you any value, let me ask you to buy my stuff. And they're like, like what the heck? So that's how it plays off. Now, that's not to say you never use pre-roll. What I recommend is use it sparingly. And if you have like something time sensitive or like a big announcement or like a launch or something like that, then you can do pre-roll, but understand that it's going to heavily damage your retention rates and your completion rates, which is the same thing, by the way. Retention rates, completion rates, same thing. So you can use pre-roll. I would say use it rarely, understand what the trade-offs are. Then there's mid-roll and post-roll. There is debate as to which is best. I don't think either is best. It's just understand how they're different. Mid roll is going to be the one where more people hear it than post roll because fewer people get to the end than get to the middle, right? There's always natural drop off. So mid-roll is going to have more people hearing it, but it's going to have fewer people taking action because it's in the middle of the episode and they're like doing something. Because that's the thing about
Mm.
podcast listeners. They're doing something while they're listening to your podcast. So if you say, "Hey, go and get my freebie," and they're like squatting in the squat rack, which I might be the only person who's insane enough to listen to podcasts while working out really hard, but I
I
do,
do.
right? Okay, okay. So many of us do. But there's other people who like are driving home from work. What are they going to pull over on I-95 and download your freebie? No. Then the odds that they're going to remember it later are low. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do mid rolls because that's actually the one that I recommend the most because of what I said before. The more people hear it, but then the post roll is the one where the least amount of people are going to hear it because the episode's over. Many people are going to turn it off. But it's the best time for action because the episode's over and they're pulling out their phone and they're more in a place to actually do something. So, what I recommend for business owners is do both. Have a mid roll, have a post roll. Don't make them the same thing, but make each of them one thing. It's
Mm.
not, and this is what I hear all the time business owners at the end of the episode, they're like, if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to give us a rating on Apple Podcasts. If you want this, go to my website and follow me on X and Instagram and this. Oh, and by the way, it's like, nobody's going to do anything when you give them 8 options. But if you give them one option and tell them why they should do that one thing right now, then they're more likely to do it.
That makes a lot of sense. It's kind of like you're answering that one question for your episode. You have to have one clear call to action as well, which is probably going to relate to that question.
Bingo.
Yeah, perfect. So, how does SEO play a role in podcasts? Like for we were talking about retention. Well, we have to have people listening to our podcast in order to be able to work on retention. Does SEO play a role in people finding us? How do we get people to find us?
Yeah. So it can. I historically have not prioritized SEO as a way to grow a podcast. And that is because what I have found is that the people who have grown a podcast via SEO swear by it. But what I found is that those people tend to already have a tech background. And so we're able to fully understand SEO because SEO is not just everybody, not everybody. Many people think SEO is just search terms, but it's not just search terms. It's search terms plus domain authority plus page load speed. Like there's a bunch of things that go into SEO. So it's not just search terms. So people, the mistake that podcasters make is that they horribly over optimize their show title and their episode titles for search terms to the point where the titles like don't really make much sense. So what I
Huh.
say is I would like to optimize my podcast for humans rather than for search engines. And another reason behind that is when somebody's searching for something on a search engine, that's a pretty transactional moment. Like their goal is to get the information as quickly as they possibly can. What they're probably not trying to do is listen to a 45-minute podcast episode on the answer to their question, right? They want it right then and there. So there are some shows that have grown via SEO. And if you do want to use SEO as a strategy, because again, if we're not using social media at all, then you want to make sure that your show's name, your show title is something that people might search for. So, there's a client of mine who got incredible SEO benefits because his show was called Intelligent Investing, I think.
Hmm.
Yeah. His show is called Intelligent Investing. And I believe Intelligent Investing was like the name of like a book or something, or like it's a framework of how to invest. And so people were searching for that in the podcast apps. So it worked. So that's the key here is we're not looking for search engine like Google, like somebody's searching for an answer. Because also this is probably not something we want to get into now, but like AI and like ChatGPT is starting to eat into people using search engines. But podcast SEO, people searching in podcast apps, is worthwhile to consider. But again, I would rather optimize the podcast for humans and for listeners and for psychology than for search terms.
Yeah, I love that. Optimize it for humans. I mean, that's who we're talking to, right? That's who we're trying to build relationships with. So, what are some of the ways that you found that have worked really well for you to grow your own show?
There are several. And what I have found working more than 5 years in podcast growth, really it's 7 years because I did my own podcast for 2 and then I've helped others for 5 so far. And I've worked directly with 460 Show. There's been about 50,000 podcasts that I've come across. And I say all that to say, I've seen all the strategies, I think most of them anyway, and they all work. All of them. They all work, and they'll all work for your show. All of them. So if you're a podcaster who's hearing me right now and you're like, yeah, that strategy doesn't work, it does. It just hasn't, you just haven't gotten it to work for you yet. So there are several strategies that work to grow a podcast, but here's what's really important to understand. Audio podcasts do not have an algorithm. So it is the only medium online right now, I think, except maybe email, that doesn't have a big company with a magic algorithm that's just showing content to people that might be interested in it. I say with audio podcasting, you have to be your own algorithm. You have to go and get people to discover that your podcast exists elsewhere, which we can talk about in a minute how to do that without social media, and get them to then tune into your show. So, keeping that in mind, the ways that you can grow a podcast, we've mentioned SEO and why I don't really necessarily think we should consider that. There's turning your show into a YouTube show. There is ways to do it on social media. And then my favorite way is growing within the podcast world. And that is when podcast listeners discover that your podcast exists while they're listening to another podcast. And there's two reasons why this is so impactful to focus on this as your strategy. Reason number one, roughly 40% of adults in the US, 40 to 60%, listen to podcasts, which means that roughly 40 to 60% of adults don't listen to podcasts at all, and you're probably not going to get them to start. So, all of the strategies that aren't within the podcast world, social media, SEO, anything else, 40 to 60% of the people that you reach don't listen to shows, and you're probably not going to be able to get them to start. So, it's kind of only 50% effective. The other reason why focusing on in podcast world strategies is so effective is because you're reaching 100% podcast listeners while they are being a podcast listener. So, Gabe, before we both discovered that we listen to podcasts while we're working out.
Hmm.
So, tell me, do you think it's more likely that you're going to listen to a podcast that you discovered earlier in the day while you were scrolling social media and watching Netflix, or a podcast that you heard about while you were listening to a podcast while you were working out?
Definitely the second. And I have done that many times. That's how I find new shows to listen to.
Exactly. And that's because in that moment, you are in the context of being a podcast listener. And podcast listener Gabe is a different person than TikTok scrolling Gabe. Very
Hmm.
different person, different desires, different interests, different wants. So if you can reach people while they are in the context of being a podcast listener and they can discover your podcast in that moment, number one, it's just so easy for them to switch over and listen to yours because they're already listening. They've got their earbuds in. They're doing the thing that they do when they listen to podcasts. But also, you're reaching them in that same mental context when they're like, yes, I would like to listen to a podcast right now. So it just becomes so much more efficient to do it in this way.
Yeah, totally. But this is one of my favorite strategies too. Like when we're talking about not utilizing social media, something that you brought up, Kevin, is like when I used to scroll Facebook or Instagram, now I'm not on there for anything life or business, but when I did
Love
that,
it.
I didn't want to be pulled away from there. I was there to connect with the people who were there and to see pretty pictures or funny memes or whatever it was. I didn't want to go find a podcast there. So when we are like mindlessly posting about our podcast on social media, it can take away from the value add we can put other places. Like I feel like we could grow in so many different ways if we took that focus and put it elsewhere, like you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, just last night, I was sitting on the couch. I have not completely eliminated social media from my life. Sitting on the couch, watching Succession on HBO and like kind of half scrolling at the same time. And I came across a podcast episode where I think it was a clip. Oh, yeah, I know what it was. It was a clip of Arnold Schwarzenegger being interviewed on some podcast. And it was a great clip. And I was like, oh, man, I want to listen to this episode because I can't remember off the top of my head who the host was. But I was like, oh, I'd love to hear these two talk. And what's funny is I like thought of that and then I even because I know what I know, I'm like, what a shame. I'm probably not going to remember to listen to this. And I completely forgot about it until just now. So maybe because of this interview, I'm going to remember to go listen to that podcast episode. But the point is, if not for us having this conversation, even though that podcaster did the thing, they made the clip, it got in front of me, it worked, I didn't tune in. And so what was the point?
Right. We forget. I mean, like, unless I write it down, I'm not going to remember, especially like, what's the show called? How do I find it? All the things. So when I'm on the podcast platform, it's easier for me to go into the podcast and find that show right away. Which I will stop running in order to do that. Like that's one of those things I will pause or I'll pause my workout. Like that's when I listen to podcasts. I'm either driving or I'm working out
Right.
too. So, yeah. And so I think it's a really great strategy to grow. Now, do you have any tips when it comes to podcasters guesting on other shows? I know one of my favorite things is actually to ask for a podcast swap. Hey, you have a podcast? I have one. I can add value in this way to your show. You can add value to my show. It's a great way to get out there in a couple different ways. What are some other things that you've found to be helpful?
Yeah, so just a couple rapid fire tips. If you're looking to podcast guests specifically, one thing to understand is that the cat's out of the bag a little bit when it comes to podcast guesting. So if you have a podcast, you get pitches all the time. And a
Yeah.
lot of those pitches are really not applicable to your show. It's very clear that the person is paying an assistant to just send podcast pitches to a million shows, which I pity the person who's doing that because that person is actually being interviewed on a bunch of podcasts that have no listenership. Because the podcasts that accept the fastest tend to have the least amount of listeners. So you want to not take the approach that everybody else is taking, which is number one, they pitch as many shows as they could potentially find and just like spray and pray volume, right? Number two is they send the pitch in the first email. That's the number one mistake. And
Hmm.
again, you've seen it over and over again. You get, hey, Gabe, like I'm a huge fan of podcast name, and I'm like they do that to me. They're like, go ahead, go.
They also put my old podcast name because I've changed my podcast 3 times.
Right, and they're like, "I'm such a big fan. I listen every week." And I'm like, "Oh, this is so cringe. Like, you're just destroying this." So here's the tip. Instead of just sending the pitch and going for the jugular in the cold email, and instead of making, because like, just I do this with everything. Just like how every single podcast episode should ask a specific question, I believe that every single email you send should ask one specific question. So when you just send the pitch as the first email, the question that that email is asking is, will you have me on your show? It's a very difficult question to answer. And so what do people do? Even if it's a good pitch, which usually it's not, they're like, oh, that's interesting. But I don't really know right away if I want to commit to having you on the show. So I'm like, oh, I'm going to come back to this. And they never do. They don't come back and they don't answer it. But if instead the question that your email is asking is, where do you prefer to receive guest pitches?
Hmm.
Then the answer is either right here. What do you got? Or fill out this form or email my assistant or whatever it is. But the goal here is not to get a yes for you being on the show, it's to get a response. And then when you get that response, then you send the pitch. And here's the bonus point is that you can personalize that pitch even more because you'll find that about 20 to 40% of the shows that you pitch in this way, the way that I just described, will respond to you. And so you're able to customize just the 20 to 40% of shows that are actually going to have a conversation with you rather than all of them. Versus when you pitch in the way that I described before that everybody else is pitching, you usually get about a 1% response rate, 1 out of 100. So that's tip number one to get in touch with other shows. The other tip that I'll say though is just like I said, the cat's out of the bag a little bit. I'm not saying that podcast guesting isn't good, but it's getting so popular and there's getting to be so much volume of podcast pitches that it's starting to be harder and harder to get on good shows. And like I said before, the bigger the audience, the longer it takes them to respond and the harder it is to get on the show. So the easier it is, the more you're just going to be on shows that don't have listenership. So what I'm seeing working right now, and I don't have as many frameworks behind this because this is kind of a little bit cutting edge, but is more of a collaborative non-guesting sharing way of sharing each other's shows. So that's like swapping promos, swapping ads, or even buying ads on other shows. We're starting to have that work like crazy. And here's the actual tip. If you're going to collaborate with another podcaster, do a promo swap post roll.
Okay.
So like if we're gonna swap, I'm gonna tell people about your podcast post roll. Same thing you for mine, because like we said before, that ending moment is when people have their phones out. They've already pulled their phone out. They've already pulled over and stopped their run. So the odds that they're gonna jump over to the other show is higher. And also podcasters tend to not care as much about post-roll because those are the low, it's the cheapest ad, inventory. It's usually not sold. So they're like, yeah, sure. So that's the secret tip.
Okay, love that. I've been kind of thinking and learning a little bit more about like the promos, swapping promos or buying ad space on podcasts per se. And I'm interested when it comes to pitching, would you pitch differently in that way, or would your pitch look very similar to what you were talking about when it comes to guest podcasting?
So here's what I recommend. When you pitch yourself as a guest. For the shows that you guest on that are effective, go back to those shows and buy
Mm,
ads.
okay, great tip.
This allows you to test shows for free and you get featured on that show. So number one, you get to test the show for free. You become a guest, you see the results, and then you're like, okay, I know that this audience is interested in what I have to say. Let me buy ads on that show. And also, the audience of that show gets a great experience as well because they hear the ad and they're like, oh my gosh, I remember Gabe. Amazing. And so you kind of get to double dip in terms of the benefits.
Okay, I love that because then it's a warm audience. It's where you should be spending money and time.
And it's a warm podcast host because they've already had you on the show.
Yeah, and I'd say, I've had a few people that have been my favorites. I've had them on my show multiple times because we've just clicked really well, and the topics really resonate with my audience. So I'd be more apt to be like, yeah, for sure, I will do an ad for you, or
Right.
you can buy an ad on my
You'd be
show.
thrilled. You'd be thrilled
Mhm.
because your audience likes them. Like it just wins all around.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we're winding down, I mean, I could talk about this forever with you. We have so much to talk about here. Do you have any other like things to think about or tips when it comes to growing our podcast without relying on social media?
Yeah. So I'm actually going to go way back to the beginning, to the fundamentals. And I'm glad you asked that because there's another issue that many podcasters don't realize that they have. And it is that nobody knows what their show is about. So the
Mm,
podcaster either named the show after themselves or they named the show something super vague. And it's just not clear to a complete and total stranger. What am I going to get if I tune into this show? So my number one tip for any podcaster who's not growing is get really good at telling me what your show is going to do for me, not what you're going to do on the show. So when I go to conferences and people find out that I help people with their podcasts, they'll be like, "Oh, can you, like grow my show?" And I say, "Great. Tell me about your podcast." And they'll say something like, "I share my expertise on XYZ." Or they'll say, "I interview successful entrepreneurs." I'm like, "I don't care what you do. I want to know what listening to your show is going to do for me." And then they always like look up and they're like, "Huh, I never thought of it that way." And I'm like, "Exactly. If you haven't thought about what your show is going to do for your listeners, how on earth do you expect your listeners to know what it is going to do for them?" So, what I recommend is developing a quick one sentence tagline. So, for example, my show, the Grow the Show podcast, what I don't say is on Grow the Show, I share my secrets of 5 years of podcast growth expertise and I interview successful podcasters. That's not what I say. I say, Grow the Show is the podcast that grows your podcast. So
mm,
when I say it that way, you're like, ooh, I'm going to listen to that, right? Compared to I interview, right? And really what happens, I call it the eyes test because when you describe it the first way where it's like, I interview successful entrepreneurs, people's eyes glaze over and they're like, oh, that's cool. Okay, I think I'm going to go get a drink. But if you say, my podcast grows your podcast, their eyes light up. And they're like, whoa, that's really interesting. How long have you been into this? And it's simply, did you talk about it from your perspective or their perspective? So that's the number one secret. It's, like I said, it's a little bit more abstract. It's not as tactical as people want because everybody wants the tactics. But this is where I find most people are messing up.